If someone slaughtered the Passover lamb, painted the blood over their doorframe, but didn't eat the lamb, what would happen? Would they wake up in the morning to find their firstborn son dead? At what point does an animal change from being an animal and become a sacrifice? Is it the slaughter? Is it the altar? Is it the blood? Is it even a sacrifice if it's not food? So according to Leviticus, if you had a lamb for sacrifice, but it died in the field, it's now unclean and disqualified for sacrifice. So maybe bringing it to the temple makes it a sacrifice. But Noah and Abraham offered sacrifices without a temple. Maybe placing a hand on the head. Yet the grain offering is a sacrifice and it doesn't have a head. Well, I guess there are heads of grain or ears of corn. The Passover lamb didn't have a hand placed on its head either. Yet, according to Exodus 12:27, it says it is the Passover sacrifice to Yahweh. However, this sacrifice has one or two distinct differences to pretty much all other sacrifices. Hey there, my name's Phil Bray, and this is episode 2 in a special series that I'm doing on Passover. So for this Paschal period, we're taking a break from our regular Leviticus activities, and instead we'll be exploring Passover lambs, blood, covenant, Jesus, and today, food. Last episode, we looked at the word Passover, or Pesach, or in Greek, Pascha, and what the word means, and what it means, or what it meant to celebrate the Passover in the Old Covenant, and what it means to continue to celebrate Passover in the New Covenant with Jesus as the Lamb. Today, we're specifically looking at how Passover is a meal. And I want to start with a question. For a sacrifice to be a sacrifice, what are the essential steps? And spoiler, a sacrifice is food, but does someone actually have to eat the sacrifice for it to be effective? I don't know if you've ever thought about that, because sometimes we think that all that's required for a sacrifice is a dead animal. So to start, I want to do something I've never done before. I want to do something completely different. I want to read from an ancient Greek epic. It's from the story of Prometheus and Zeus, because I want to ask the question, where is the meaning of a sacrifice contained or communicated? And I want to start with an example of a culture from a similar time. It's possible that they were both written, maybe not written, but the setting is roughly the same time as Passover, possibly. So while it's not Hebrew, it's ancient Greek, but it definitely reflects the ancient understanding of what a sacrifice represents. So as I read, have a think about where the meaning of the sacrifice lies. Here we go. For when the gods and mortal men had a dispute, the Titan Prometheus was crafty, and he sought to deceive Zeus. He cut up a great ox and set 2 portions before them. Before the mortal men he piled meat and inner parts thick with fat upon the hide, concealing them under the ox's stomach. But for Zeus, he put the bare white bones, cleverly disguised and covered with glistening fat. Then Zeus, that wise father of men and of gods, said to him, "Most glorious Prometheus, how unfairly you have divided the portions." But cunning Prometheus, not forgetting his crafty trick, smiled softly and said, "Zeus, most glorious and greatest of the eternal gods, take whichever of these portions your heart desires." It's a great story, hey? 2 piles of food, and Zeus is given the option to select which pile of food he thinks looks best, the most appetizing. And so, Passover. As an Israelite was preparing for Passover, where did the meaning lie? To answer the question, like last episode, let's allow the Bible to tell us what is significant. So I'm going to read a bit of a chunk from Exodus, where Yahweh first gives the instructions for Passover. And as I read, same thing, ask yourself, what step in the Passover sacrifice contributes the most meaning? Where does the meaning of Passover come from? So here we go, Exodus chapter 12, and I'll start in verse 3. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are to each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's households. A lamb for each household. So 1 lamb for each household. Verse 4, now if any household is too small for a whole lamb, so this might be significant. Is it the size of the lamb that's important? Let's see. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor. Having taken into account the number of people there are, you are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. So that's why the size of the lamb is significant. It's according to how much each person will eat. Verse 5, your lamb shall be male, without blemish, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall slaughter it. So here's an instruction about the slaughter. And what meaning might the text attached to this step in the ritual? It says, you shall slaughter it at twilight. That's it. We're not told how or why, we're only told when, as the sun is going down. The instructions keep going. Verse 7, moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses. So here we've got some instructions about blood. And don't worry, because we're going to have a whole episode on blood. Not today, but it's coming up. Take some of the blood and put it on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. Okay, from here, I'm going to sound a ding every time there's an instruction around eating. And I think you'll start to see a pattern. So I've got my bike bell here. If I can get it to ding. Okay. And they shall eat the flesh that night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs along with its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left of it until morning you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Passover of Yahweh. And from there, God says that he will pass through the land and will strike the firstborn, but the blood is to be assigned to them. And don't worry, we'll talk about blood. It's in episode 5. It's coming up. Verse 14, now this will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast. That's eating, ding. A feast to Yahweh throughout your generations. You are to celebrate it as a perpetual statute. Then, immediately, we move on to more instructions around how to prepare and eat the unleavened bread. So, obviously, loads of the ritual is focused on the eating. But which steps in the ritual were most significant to the meaning of the sacrifice? The blood is said to have meaning. It is a sign for you. And God says, you shall cook it in this way. It's to be roasted with fire, not raw or boiled. And then God says, now you shall eat it in this manner. But God never says, now you shall slaughter it in this manner. 2 things made you an Israelite: circumcision and Passover, if you're a male. That's how central it was to Israel's identity. If you didn't celebrate Passover, you were basically saying that we don't want to identify as the people of God. We don't want to identify as the people God redeemed to himself out of slavery in Egypt to be to him a special possession or a treasured possession. It's such an important event that it changed the Israelites' calendar. The very first Passover, when God, here in chapter 12, when God gives the instructions, he begins like this. In verse 2, he states, "This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of your year." And then, after the instructions that we just read, they're repeated because it becomes a liturgy. The instructions are repeated to lay out how they shall do it every year, forever. And when they celebrate this every year, when the instructions are repeated, what's the very first thing that Yahweh wants to make sure they understand? So verse 43, Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it, but for every slave that after you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. A stranger or a hired worker shall not eat it." And it goes on. So I've said that the meaning of Passover is in the eating. Not only in the eating, but I think the majority of the meaning of Passover lies in the eating. The meaning's in the eating. Maybe that can be our slogan. I'll get t-shirts made up. So I should be more specific. Every part of the meal had meaning. So Exodus 12:8 says, "They shall eat the flesh, or the meat, that night, roasted with fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, they shall eat it." First, the bitter herbs. While not immediately explicit, later Jewish interpretation makes a direct connection between the bitter herbs and how Pharaoh treated the Israelites. So in Exodus 1, it says, "The Egyptians used violence to compel the sons of Israel to labor, and they made their lives bitter with hard slave labor in mortar and bricks and in all kinds of slave labor in the field, all their slave labor which they brutally compelled them to do." So basically, the bitter herbs represent the bitterness of bondage. Next, the unleavened bread. Later in the chapter, the meaning of the lack of leaven is made explicit. In chapter 12, verse 39, it says, "The people baked the dough into unleavened loaves. It had no yeast because, when they were driven out of Egypt, they could not delay." So the bread symbolizes the urgency. They didn't have time to wait for the bread to rise. It's about haste in the rescue. So, and actually later, leaven is associated with impurity spreading throughout. And you can go back actually and watch the episode that I did on leprosy, where I talk about things, yeast spreading and leprosy spreading. So I think you could also read into this that they had to leave the impurity of Egypt behind. And the blood was painted with a branch of hyssop. And Psalm 51 lets us know that hyssop is associated with cleansing and with purifying. So in verse 7, David says, "Purify me with hyssop, and I will be clean." So they were marking that household as pure amongst all the impurity of Egypt's gods, as belonging to the God of life, not the angel of death. There's so much more going on, but we'll get into that in another episode, probably that episode on blood. Okay, since these original instructions in Exodus, the meaning of the Jewish meal has evolved a lot. There's so much that I could get into, but I won't at the moment, because there's stuff like the 4 cups and the psalms that they recite at the Passover meal. It's really cool. And actually, I'll link a book in the description about it. But I want to stay within Exodus for this video. And I'll talk about the book again at the end because there's something really cool that I'm going to read from. I'll do an episode on the significance of the lamb too. I realize that I'm leaving out the meat part of it. But I want to do an episode where I'll ask if the lamb was a substitute. So, I mean, make sure you've clicked subscribe because there's so much good stuff coming up. And maybe while you're clicking subscribe right now, just click like as well, because that'll help out. Okay, while you're doing that, pause. I'll pause. Don't you pause. Keep watching. I've been de-emphasizing the slaughter. Yep, I admit that. And I admit too that I'm reacting against something. I'm reacting against the tendency to overemphasize the slaughter. So last episode, I set a challenge. And today I've got another challenge for you, or maybe homework. Find some ancient Hittite or Babylonian texts. Read Homer's Iliad. And overwhelmingly, what you'll find is people presenting food to gods over and over again. And what they're doing is they're hoping to propitiate or gain the favor of that god. But my challenge would be to demonstrate that compared to Israel's neighbors, does Yahweh shift the focus the focus of a sacrifice away from food? Because as I read Leviticus, there's a lot of awfully delicious sounding language in there. For example, Leviticus 3:16 says, "The priest shall offer all the fat up in smoke on the altar as food, an offering by fire as a soothing aroma, all fat is Yahweh's." Leviticus 21 verse 6 says, "The priests are to be holy to their God, for they present the food offerings to Yahweh, the food of their God." Numbers 28 says, "Command the Israelites and say to them, see that you present to me at its appointed time the food for my food offerings as a pleasing aroma to me." And in Malachi, God says to the priests, "You are presenting defiled food upon my altar. But you say, how have we defiled you? In that you say, the table of the Lord is to be despised." So there are three different Hebrew words for sacrifice. And I'll try and be quick because I've done this in other videos. But the first sacrifice presented to God in the Bible was when Cain and Abel brought offerings. So Cain brought an offering of fruit, and Abel brought the choicest fatty portions from his flock. Interestingly, the Hebrew word used here is mincha, which is the same word used for the grain offerings in Leviticus. And basically it just means a gift or a present or like a tribute. The word in Exodus 12:27 though, that we read before, is a different word. So where it says it is a Passover sacrifice to Yahweh, that word is zebach. And the word zebach is very interesting. So I noticed that in Leviticus, it's used, I think, explicitly or exclusively for the peace offering. And what's different about the peace offering? So it's the one that's taken home and eaten as a meal by the offerer and his family. And once I noticed that, I wondered how that word zebach is used in the rest of the Bible. So I checked. And if you can do the homework yourself, if you look at every time that word zebach, and it often gets translated as sacrifice in our English Bibles, but every time pretty much it's used within the context of a meal. So the first time this word is used, zebach, is when Jacob makes a covenant with his father-in-law. It says in Genesis 31:54, "Then Jacob offered a sacrifice, zebach, on the mountain, and called his relatives to the meal, and they ate the meal and spent the night on the mountain." Another time is in 1 Samuel 2:13. It says, "Now it was the practice of the priests that when any of the people offered a sacrifice, zebach, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand, while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or the kettle or the cauldron or pot, and whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself." The most common word for sacrifice, however, is korban. And this one basically means nearness gift. It's the word we'll read in our English Bibles as offering, because it's a gift that is brought near and presented to God. It's the word that when we read about the burnt offering or the sin offering, that's that word, korban, the idea of coming close or drawing near to God. And this word actually turns up as like a little Easter egg in Mark's Gospel, in its Hebrew form, actually. Even though Mark's writing in Greek, he slips this word in Hebrew. And it's when Jesus is accusing the Pharisees and the scribes of hypocrisy. So they were basically saying that they couldn't provide for their parents. Because according to Jesus, they were saying, whatever I have that would help you is korban. And then Mark helpfully inserts this little helpful hint for us in brackets saying, that is a gift given to God. That's from Mark chapter 7, verse 11. With all the offerings, the guilt offering, the sin offering, the peace offering, the grain offerings, the priests receive a portion of the food, and God receives the best bits, the fatty portions. But the burnt offering is different. This isn't eaten by any human, because it's all for God. God gets all of it. But it's still a food gift. Leviticus 1, chapter 13 says, the priest will then present all of it and burn it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. Now, I'm not saying that God eats the offering. Yahweh is pretty clear about that. In Psalm 50, he says, everything that moves on the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the whole world is mine and everything it contains. Shall I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of male goats? So he's basically saying, no, I don't need you to feed me because the whole world is mine. However, if you have a read of Daniel chapter 14, just try and find it in your Bible. If you can't find chapter 14 of Daniel in your Bible, try a Catholic or Orthodox Bible. So it's the story of Daniel and Bel. And it's an amazing piece of ancient satire where the king of Babylon is so confident that his god, Bel, eats the food that the priests leave out for him every night. It's a great story. So here's the question. What kind of sacrifice was the Passover? It's not a sin offering, because the word sin or atonement actually doesn't ever appear in the Passover story. It's not a grain offering because it's a lamb. A peace offering? Well, yeah, the word used to describe it is zabach, which is that word that implies that it's a meal. But there's more similarity between the peace offering and the Passover. They're both eaten at home by a family, and they both have a use-by date. So on that, I suspect that the use-by date is there so that there's no temptation to store up meat. There's no temptation to be greedy and eat more lamb than you're supposed to. The whole idea of the peace offering was to celebrate peace with each other and peace with God. So you were supposed to celebrate it with the entire community. If there was any lamb left over, then that meant that you hadn't invited enough people to the party. And we saw this kind of sentiment echoed in the Passover instructions, where God says 1 lamb per household, or if your household is too small for a whole lamb, share it with your neighbours, according to how much each person will eat. That's chapter 12, verse 4. Okay. Usually what I find to be the simplest definition, or the simplest way to define sacrifice in the Bible, is simply a gift of a meal given to God. But there's a problem with Passover. Which part was given to God? And here is where one of the main differences becomes one of the most beautiful parts of Passover. So with the burnt offering, all of it was sent up to God as a pleasing aroma. But with Passover, none of it is given to God. It's like a reverse burnt offering. It's as though while they were in enemy territory, while they were slaves in a foreign land, God says, here, you have all of this. You can bring me gifts after I bring you safely out of Egypt. But now, this lamb is entirely for you and your families. Let's return to the question that we began with. If someone didn't eat the lamb, what would have happened? So here, that book that I was telling you about, I want to read a section from a book by Dr. Brant Pitre. I think that's how you pronounce it, Brant Pitre. His book is called Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, Unlocking the Secrets of the Last Supper. And this book is amazing. It's written from a Roman Catholic perspective, so it might sound a bit provocative to Protestant ears, but, well, I guess be provoked. You might pick up on where he's taking his argument, and I don't want to really get into that debate, but this book, and this section in particular, it really forced me to think a lot more carefully about what it means to participate in the Eucharist, in the Lord's Supper. Okay, I'm going to read. Have a listen. He says, if a certain Israelite family did not particularly care for the taste of lamb, what would have happened? If they took the lamb, sacrificed the lamb, spread the blood of the lamb, but did not eat the lamb, what would have been the result? Well, the book of Exodus does not say, but it's a good guess that when they awoke the next morning, their firstborn son would be dead. For, as any ancient Jew would have known, the Passover sacrifice was not completed by the death of the lamb, but by eating its flesh. The Passover was not completed by the death of the victim, but by a communion of sorts, by eating the flesh of the sacrifice. So he goes on to argue that it was important for an Israelite to eat the flesh, the meat of the lamb. And with that in mind, he says that it's important for us to eat Christ's flesh and drink his blood. Okay, this here is my favorite, very nerdy, extremely niche meme. I don't know if you can read it, but the father's painting what seems to be lamb's blood on the doorframe, saying, this marinara sauce represents lamb's blood. And the son is quite nervous because he's wondering what's going to happen. So that's not the debate I want to get into, because Zwingli, one of the reformers, was adamant that the blood and wine is merely a symbol and nothing more. While Luther was equally adamant that when Luther said, "This is my blood," he says, well, when Jesus said "is," he meant "is." Hello, Messi. All right, I want to read a bit more from the book. This is messy. Okay, here's a bit more from the book. He says, it's worth noting that according to Exodus, the Passover was not an open table, but a covenant feast. Only Israelites could eat any of it. Any Gentile foreigner, that is, a non-Israelite, who wanted to eat the flesh of the lamb, first had to be circumcised and become a member of Israel. In other words, this was no ordinary meal, but a sacred family ritual. Only members of the covenant family of God were able to partake of it. Maybe here to finish, I'll leave you with some more provocative questions. Is it important to participate in the Lord's Supper? Yes, of course it is. Just as a part of Israel's identity was participating in the Passover meal, so for us, participating in the meal of Christ is a participation with Jesus and a way of identifying as the people of Christ, as the body of Christ. And this is why Paul stresses that the meal must not be received in an unworthy manner. Another question. If sacrifice is a meal, if the meaning's in the eating, what's the consequence of eating a meal with a God? With any God? Listen to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He says, "The things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I don't want you to become partners with demons." According to Paul, the result of sacrificing to demons might mean that you're looking to partner with them. So it's very important to understand what a sacrifice is. And what does sacrificing to demons look like? Is it eating a meal with them? So from verse 14, Paul answers the question. He says, from verse 17, "Therefore flee from idolatry. Look at the people of Israel. Are those who eat the sacrifices not partners in the altar? What do I mean then? That food sacrificed to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No. But I say that things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I don't want you to become partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the you cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? That's why God got so angry with the Israelites for sacrificing to other gods. Because a sacrifice is a meal, and in the ancient world, eating a meal with someone, sharing a table with them, meant that you were partnering with them. Final provocative question. Is the Lord's Supper a sacrifice? Yeah, of course it is. It's a gift, but this time the gift is given to us. And it's a meal that we participate with God. Earlier, how did I define sacrifice? I said the gift of a meal given to God. And how is Passover different? It's still a meal, but it was given to the Israelites. So the only reason that people have had a problem with referring to Holy Communion as a sacrifice is because they've misunderstood sacrifice. And this is precisely why I was de-emphasizing the slaughter. It's because many people have the misunderstanding that what defines sacrifice is the death. And it's not. It's part of it, but without the food, there's no sacrifice. So, no, the Lord's Supper is not a re-sacrificing of Jesus. It's not a re-killing of Jesus. And that's what some of the reformers were worried about. They thought that part of the Latin Mass suggested that Jesus was being killed again and again every time they celebrated Mass. But that's not what's happening. It is a participation in Jesus' death. It's a participation in the once-for-all sacrifice of Jesus. And we offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. And we offer to God a sacrifice of praise. And like the Passover, God gives to us his Son and his body and blood. The meal is important because the meal is a participation in and with Christ. Okay, again, that was a lot. I'm sorry. That was a long episode. I need to keep these episodes shorter. Next time I'll try harder. Next episode is on worship is sacrifice, or sacrifice is worship. So make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you next time. Bye.